Hey, good evening. Welcome to Introduction to SQL Part 1 Live Stream Edition. I'm Dr. Todd Wolfe, and tonight I will be sharing with you the overview and basics of the SQL language, ways that you can get started working with SQL, the data query language commands, and the SQL DML commands, the data manipulation commands. We'll wait just a couple minutes and we'll see if other viewers connect, and we will get started. Again, I'm doing this session as a fundraiser for St. Jude's Children's Hospital. As I've told my subscribers previously and some others, that I will be participating in the half marathon in Las Vegas at the end of February. So far, I've raised over $1,000 towards my campaign and towards my fundraising. And anybody that watches this recording or even the live stream, if you'd like to contribute, my link is available in the chat window for you to consider doing so. So we'll get started, and we'll go through these various topics that I have outlined here, and hopefully by the end of watching this session you'll be able to have a good understanding of working with the SQL language and where to go to expand your knowledge in the future. If this gets good feedback and others are interested, I will cover a more in-depth session. Again, tonight goal is for just an overview and get yourself familiar with the language and be able to get started working with some of the SQL commands out there. Before we get into it, just in case you're not familiar with SQL, it stands for the Structured Query Language, and it's been around since the 1970s. So sometimes you might ask yourself, well, why do you want to learn something that is so old? This is a technology that's like 50 years old. It's been around longer than I have. It's one of the first languages that I learned in the late 90s. But the unique thing about it, I've used it just about every day in my career since the late 90s. It's a rare day where I do not actually utilize some SQL, either in sharing it with students in the courses I teach in the evenings or in my day-to-day work in terms of querying databases or assisting and helping other developers. This language is used in all relational databases out there, and it's an English-like language, much like Python and some other languages that are very popular and trending right now, like Python and R. It's just not as sexy. People don't look at SQL the same way. When you think about your data science languages, Python really comes to mind, but SQL doesn't. Although if you were to look at all of the jobs out there that are looking for experienced individuals, they're all going to look for background in the SQL language, and you're going to need that knowledge. It's knowledge that's needed by programmers. It's knowledge that's needed by data scientists, data analysts, business analysts, quality analysts. They all will need to have some level of SQL knowledge, most likely in their day-to-day jobs and their roles. Again, depending upon your specific role, you may need different elements or aspects of the SQL language. When it comes to the non-programmer type roles, the non-techie roles, you're going to work with the DQL, mostly the data query language. When it comes to the more of the programming language, you're going to work with some of the other aspects of it that we'll talk about in a minute. Another great thing about the SQL language, these are just a handful of companies on this slide that uses it, and obviously these are all modern companies, logos that you're familiar with, but there's thousands and thousands of companies out there that are leveraging the language and using it every single day. So if you pick up the skill and you work with the skill, it's something that's going to be valuable to you in a variety of not only roles, but a variety of companies as well. One of the job sites that I like to go to very frequently to share when it comes to seeing what skills that are in the market or in demand for different roles, dice.com. If you go check out dice.com, you do a search for SQL, you'll see thousands of job postings out there that look for that as one of your skill sets. And then from there, when you find a job posting that you might be interested in, you would look at what other skills complement SQL, and that's how you figure out what your maybe your learning plan and your depth of the various aspects are that you might want to focus in on and consider picking up in addition to some of the skills that you'll learn here in this session this evening. Before we get into the language, I just want to point out some differences of terms that you may run into when working and learning about SQL. You'll hear DDL, DQL, and DML pretty frequently. DDL is the data definition language. This is the language that is used to create your database objects, also to drop them and to alter them. So this defines your database schema, and this is where you start when you're building a database. You would write the data definition language commands, and if you're on that programmer job spectrum, these commands are going to be useful to you. Same as if you're working like as a SQL database administrator possibly. Although in many cases nowadays you might end up using a designer tool like SQL Server Management Studio or MySQL Workbench and a variety of other ones out there, or even your Visual Studio and your Eclipse coding interfaces to build your objects versus writing the raw SQL DDL commands, although you should know them and you should be familiar with them if you're going to work in the more technical roles of building out databases in the long term. The area of focus for this evening, and the ones of focus for those of you that want to go into data science, go into BA and QA roles, as well as into programming roles you'll need. This is more of the business focused part of the language, and this is the data query language. This is what you use for interrogating your databases. So whenever I look at the commands that fall into the DQL section, I always say this is where you are interrogating the database and you're going to ask it questions. And this will be key for us. Everyone wants to know how to formulate queries to get the desired result sets back. Tonight we're going to keep the query simple. This is just an introduction, and we're not going to get into any of the complicated aspects of writing queries, whereby you'll have multiple conditions, you'll have joins, you'll have subqueries, and there's various combinations of functions and such that you can build into the DQL. Those are aspects we'll cover in a more advanced session later on. So if you have a desire for a more advanced session after we kind of whet your appetite with the DQL approach tonight, feel free to ask and reach out and contact me, and I'll work up a session with the more advanced aspects of the language. The DML, the data manipulation language piece, we're going to touch on that as well this evening. This is where you work and make changes with data to inside of the database. Aspects of putting data in, which would be inserting data, changing data once it's been in, which would be updating the data, and then deleting the data, which would be removing the data from your database tables as necessary. So when you think of the data manipulation language, think of the SQL commands that are going to be all about making changes to data that's in the system or putting data into the system. And then the last piece, the DCL, the data control language, and what is that for is when it comes to handling permissions in your database. And the two most common statements of the data control language, grant and revoke. So you grant access and you revoke access. So granting access gives you the ability to give access to something so somebody can get the information. Revoking access takes it away. Okay, so those are the core aspects of the SQL language. Again, we're going to focus in on the middle two, the data query language. We'll learn about the select statement tonight, and we're going to focus in on the data manipulation language, the insert, the update, and delete, and all aspects we're going to work on the basic parts. We're not going to go into anything that's too in-depth, just enough to get you started in the right direction. So where do you start, and how do you start working with SQL? Well, there's several options that are available to you on your computers that you can set up and you can install. I've given some of them on these slides, and I'll share a link to this slide deck as well, so everybody can download it and review it should they choose to. One option, the option that I'm going to primarily show tonight, is using SQL Server Management Studio, which is also known as SSMS. SQL Server Management Studio is the acronym, along with SQL Server Express. Microsoft has done an amazing job over the years of making their technologies available free of charge for non-commercial usage. And most large organizations, or mid-sized and large organizations, and even some of the smaller organizations, you're likely to run into instances of SQL Server. So the nice thing is you can have the experience working with the tooling that you're going to see in the workplace in a lot of cases. So highly recommend you to take the opportunity to download SQL Server Management Studio and set up a SQL Express database. And there's a couple sample databases that are always great for practice and demonstrating. And both of those links are here. And we're going to work with the Northwind one tonight because Northwind is simple. That database, I think it came out from Microsoft. It's not known as Northwind Traders back in the late 80s or early 90s. And it shipped with many of their database or DBase products back in the time. And it's just simple to use. So it's still available. You do have to try to do some searching. There is a GitHub script available. So that link takes you to the actual GitHub script. And you can run the script and it'll create the instance of the database and all of the sample data and everything for you. You could probably search a little bit farther and find actual backup copies and do restores as well. If anybody wants a backup copy to do a restore of, you can let me know. I'll be happy to provide one for download as well. AdventureWorks is the more recent sample database. There's another one you hear of sometimes too, is Pubs, but AdventureWorks is just more complex. The nice thing about AdventureWorks is that it has uses of various different schemas, and the database objects are categorized within the schema capabilities, which was introduced in later versions of SQL Server. I think starting with SQL Server 2005 and forward. It wasn't something that existed in the lower versions. So you could certainly download those. Of course, it's a little bit hard to follow along and take time to download during this session tonight, but it's, like I said, these links are here. This is recorded. You can come back on my YouTube channel. You will also find a couple other videos with SQL Server Management Studio and setting up those sample databases in case you're interested in how to get those set up. They're there for you as well. Another alternative to SQL Server, especially if you're not on a Windows computer, you may be interested in looking at MySQL. MySQL is just as fun to work with as it is to work with SQL Server Management Studio when you work with MySQL Workbench. One of these ideal things with SQL Server and Management Studio is the GUI interface. Well, to get a GUI interface with MySQL, the component MySQL Workbench basically gives you that capability. And which is really awesome, I think, about MySQL Workbench that stands out from SSMS is the ability to do database designs and forward engineer and reverse engineer right from Workbench. So you can actually do your entity relationship diagrams, which are your schematics. We'll talk about and look at one here this evening as well, to plan out when you're building a database, or if you're working with an existing one, you can reverse engineer it and see it. So Workbench has that kind of option built right in, which is pretty darn cool to do so. In the MySQL space, you can also download the sample databases. Folks have done the work to convert them over. Northwind has a version on MySQL somebody created on GitHub, which GitHub's awesome because you could just find just about everything out there that somebody's done. And MyWind, they called it. So instead of Northwind, it's called MyWind, but the objects are the same and the structures are the same there. So you could download the scripts and all. And then AdventureWorks, there's an AdventureWorks copy off of SourceForge for MySQL. So you can set those up, but those are going to take you some time to set up. And nice thing about all of the new web tooling and stuff that's out there, you can find online compilers for many of the languages and coding that we're working with in the industry, regardless if we're working with SQL, if we're working with Python. There's great sites out there that let us really code and have compilers and ability to play with the languages without having to set up environments. So there's always that aspect that you can consider too. I do recommend taking the time to set up the databases and go through the installations and get a feel for that, especially if you're ever going to work on the more techie side of the job spectrum when it comes to being a programmer and developer side. But if you're on the business side where you're going to use tools that are going to let you write SQL through them, maybe it's some of the reporting tools like Tableau or Power BI, and some of the other various tools that let you just write SQL commands. Even SQL Developer, some folks might have, and or maybe you'll just have SQL Server Management Studio on your computer to run queries through. That is great, but in case you just want to practice, there's two here that I like, SQLite Online and this My Compiler site. We're going to check those out just briefly, and then I'm going to do all of my work in SQL Server Management Studio tonight because it'll give us a little bit better understanding working with the databases that I already have set up there in SQL Server Management Studio. But we'll check those out first. And then my last slide before I switch over to my web browser tools. Just here is my link for anyone that does want to contribute to my cause and the reason that I'm giving this session tonight. There's my link for donating to my St. Jude's cause. So let me go over to the web browser and we'll check out the couple online tools. So the first one I'm going to go to is this mycompiler.io. And what's really nice about it here is it's not just for SQL. So if you want to have a web-based compiler for a variety of languages, you can see that in this drop-down, you can choose from SQL to a variety of other ones if you wanted to work with them right here through this site. When you go to the SQL one, it gives you example, which is nice. It gives you a create table example. So as I talked about the data definition language here, you'll see that there's a create table structure, and the SQL here basically says we're going to create a table called students, and it's going to have an ID field, which is an integer. It's a primary key. It's going to have a name field that's going to be text. That's not null, meaning that it's required for us to fill it in. It's going to have a gender field, and that's not null, and it's also required to be filled in, and that's a text-based field. And then below it, you'll see, so this ends that statement here. SQL line terminator is a semicolon. Then there's inserting some values. So this is the DML command to insert data into the structure. So this here has two insert statements, and what it essentially is doing, it's putting in a record for two students, one for Ryan, one for Joanna, filling each of the fields with data because each field is required. And then this third line, or this third section here, is writing the data query language, which is a select statement to pull data out with a simple condition of saying, show me the data that has the gender that is equal to F. And F's inside of quotation marks because that's a character-based field. So we're putting inside of quotation marks so that we can find any gender that matches that exact phrase, which is just an F. So what's cool about this little My compiler, you can see here, is that we can create an object, we can work with that object, and then we can get data back out of that object just to practice our SQL. So when you run this, and again, all of these statements are have a line terminator, so they're all going to run independently and all. And another thing here, you'll see that these lines that have the two dashes in front of them, they will not run because that's a single line comment in the SQL syntax. So if we run this real quick, you'll see that this online compiler returns the record for Joanna. Okay, so you won't see anything for the create statement, you won't see anything for the insert, but the outcome, the select line, will return Joanna. If you were to change this and run it and type in M for male, then you're going to see that Ryan comes out. So it's like a good little way to practice SQL. It doesn't have any existing structures or anything there, so it is a little bit harder if you're, like I said, non-techie, and you need to create objects, put some data in the objects, and kind of visualize all of this without having a full database GUI tool to look at. The other one I like is the SQL Online IDE, which is SQLLiteOnline.com. This one is really awesome. And the reason why it's really awesome is because they give you connections to databases that are a variety of technologies. So SQLite, for those of you that are Python users, you're probably familiar with SQLite. It's built into your Anaconda and into your Python installations. So if you wanted to work with a SQL database right out of the box, you'd be able to do so. Right? So you've probably heard of SQLite before. And then some of these other ones, you have MS SQL, you have Oracle, you have Docker, you have MariaDB. So you could actually connect to these. So for instance, if I wanted to do MS SQL here, okay, and you could see I've created an extra table. There's a demo one there, and then my session has an extra table. If I click on this demo one, you'll see that it's got three fields, ID, name, and hint, and that's the one that's showing here. If I click on mine, I created a table with just two fields called my field and my field 2. So what's really nice here is not only can I work with the sample that they give me of the demo table, practice writing the SQL language, I can create some actual objects here. So I could write like that create statement. So if I take this one from over here, let's just say I copy this create a table statement and I bring it over to this online IDE here, you'll see that if I run this, so if I just run this command now, if all goes well, you'll see over on the left I have a student's entity now, student's table or a student's entity, and you'll see inside of it there's the ID, there's the name, and there's the gender. So it persists, right? So now if I wanted to play around with the insert statements, and again I'll copy them over from here, I'll just copy these couple over for just now, and I put them on my command line here in my terminal and hit run. Okay, they'll execute. And if I go to my history over here on the right, which also has a helper for syntax, which is also very useful to you while you're writing your code, you'll see my history. It tells you if things are successful or if they fail. So if something was to fail, over here on your history you would see, and this tells you the success and the time it took to run and all. So now if I said, okay, we'll take that select statement with this tool to fetch some values, we'll bring it over, and we'll just paste it in again, just showing you how the tool works, not really focusing on a language yet. And if I run this here, you'll see that that actually errored out in this case, so that's kind of interesting. And it gave us an error. The data type text and varchar incompatible in the equal to operator. So for some odd reason, this online instance, it doesn't like the actual data type of text. I probably, since this was SQL Server, if I was to recreate those structures, most likely I would have created those with varchar. So it doesn't like the syntax there, working against the text field in SQL Server. And that's one of the pet peeves I have with relational databases, to be honest, is data types. So when we talk about all of these products and we talk about their support for the SQL language, well, they all support the SQL language to the ANSI standard that was developed back in the 70s. But one thing that they don't support the same way is data types. And those of you who have worked with different programming languages, this is probably also a pet peeve of yours with the different programming languages. They all utilize data types a little bit differently. So in this case, here, obviously, this editor, when I ran that create statement, does not like, when I'm in the SQL Server instance, to use a text data type and for this query to actually work. So it errors out, and I would have to approach it differently. But since this was SQL Server, personally, I would have used a varchar data type if I was to write that create statement. So data types will be interesting. They're useful to know about, especially with your different database products, because when you're writing your SQL language, if you're working in Oracle, if you're working in SQL Server, you're going to want to know your data types of your fields. We'll touch on that a little bit more. And this is just one of those good examples that this failed because the data type of my field does not match to how I'm trying to write this query in this case. So each of these databases will have different data types available to you, and it's not like it's a standard. Another thing that's a little different in each of these products is functions. Functions, there's some core functions that are part of the SQL standard, and then there's the functions that some of the database platforms have introduced. So again, keeping some of that in mind while you're working with the different systems will help you understand why sometimes you might run into language problems when you're building your queries and all. But these, like I said, are great little tools. Bookmark them, add them to your bag of tricks, just for the ability to work with or play with SQL syntax. But what I want to do is I want to really focus in on letting us practice and demonstrate inside a SQL Server Management Studio. So I'm going to flip up to that and bring it over on the screen. And this is SQL Server Management Studio. And the first thing when you launch SQL Server Management Studio, or SSMS, is you're going to connect to a database engine. Regardless of your tool you're going to work with, you're going to end up connecting to a database engine to perform any types of queries and all. So in this case, since this is my local computer that I'm connecting to, you'll see my local computer name, and then it's got my instance of SQL Express there. I have a named instance here, so it's not the default name. If you're doing a fresh install, yours would be called something different, or if you change the name during your installation, your server name might look a little different. And I'm setting it up to connect as myself, as the local user, which happens to also be the DB admin in this case, but that's not really necessary to run some commands. So once I'm connected, you'll see on the left-hand side of my Object Explorer, and for some reason, if you ever turn this off, you have your view. Okay, and you have your Object Explorer. Sometimes when you're working inside of your Microsoft tools and your IDEs, you need to know how to turn some of these options back on because you accidentally close them. They're all there in the view options here for SQL Server. It's just a good little tip to know about. So now that I'm connected, we can see my databases. And I have a handful on here, some different demo ones that I've built and played with. I have AdventureWorks, a couple installs of that here, and I also have the Northwind I was talking about. Northwind's the one I want to work with this evening. And the first thing I do in the field when I work with a new company or a new system that I've never worked with before is I want to see the database schema. I want to see the database entity relationship diagram, and I want to look at it to get an understanding of the structures before I start writing any queries. Another piece of information I'd like to see if I can find it is a data dictionary, if one exists. Depending upon homegrown systems versus proprietary systems. Homegrown systems, you may not get that level of information, or your documentation may not be that good. Proprietary systems, it'll depend. Some will make it available to their customers, others will not. But if it's available, then that would be a good starting point. If neither are available with SQL Server, what I will do at a minimum is I will go to database diagrams and I'll create one based upon the actual database. And I've already done this earlier, which is just a matter of right-clicking and do a new diagram and selecting all the objects. And what you'll see here is an entity relationship diagram. So all of your tables, the fields that are in them, and the lines that connect them, which is your relationships. And this is all important once you get into writing your SQL queries, because you need to know where your data is going to be located. So to me, the way I look at a relational diagram is as it's something that tells me how to put the pieces of Humpty Dumpty back together. So in a relational database, your data is broken down across many tables. And the concepts of primary keys and foreign keys are going to be very important to you to understand as you get more in depth with your SQL queries. Starting out with basic SQL queries and the basic select statement, you're not going to need to worry about your joins and your primary and foreign keys yet, but eventually you're going to have scenarios where you're going to say, well, I don't want just the customer information. I also want to know information about their order and the products that they ordered. And when you get to that level of your SQL commands, you'll see we have to go from customers through orders over to order details and down to products. And if you want to know the categories those products belong to as well, you could easily have 4 different or 5 different entities, which are also your tables, in a query. Okay, so just keep that in mind. But by starting with your diagram, this is going to help you understand how your data in a database is broken down. I like Northwind because it's simple enough. It doesn't have a large number of entities, but it's complex enough just to let us learn how to write queries that are going to need to do joins and put pieces back together, and kind of learn more as we go along. It's a good starting place that's not too complicated, because some databases, and I'll put a little bit of AdventureWorks into this category, there's a lot more structures involved, and it might be a little bit overwhelming. And if you work with a large proprietary system or financial systems databases, you could be working with hundreds of structures very easily, and having to figure out how things are put together and broken down across hundreds of structures. Working with banking core systems, I've had to basically fill up entire rooms with their entity relationship diagram printouts from a plotter because there's just so many structures to look through, and that's when having a data dictionary can come in handy, because the data dictionary can tell you where things reference to another, whereby a visualization like this is great, but sometimes they're just too big to actually see everything. So I start here before I start writing any queries, just to know what's going on. Then the next thing I like to do is I like to go over to the tables in here, and you'll see, again, these are going to be a listing of all the tables that I have here in my diagram. But what's important to me about the tables is to see the data types that I'm going to be working with when I'm writing my SQL commands. So for instance, we'll focus on the customers table as a starting point tonight. And if I look along my list, if I go to customers and if I was to expand it, we're going to see columns, and we're going to expand columns. And what I care about here is the data types, and I care about if they're nullable or not nullable. I care about that property. So when I write my queries, I know if I have to put quotation marks around strings or if they're numerics. Additionally, I know if I'm doing my insert statements, my data manipulation for updates, like what sizes I'm working with for field sizes, as addition to the data types as well. I know my primary key, so that's my unique identifier for each record in that table. So this is very helpful to me to understand because I use this in my query writing. So when I write my queries, I'm less likely to encounter errors. Because I understand the structure and I understand the data types that go with that structure. So when I have to put records in, if I have to update records, or if I just want to select data out and get results from it. So we're going to start here with customers. We're going to start with the select statement tonight. As I said in the beginning, we're really going to focus in on the data query language, the DQL. We'll finish up with a couple items from the DML, the data manipulation language, but we'll focus in on the DQL, and we're going to keep it simple. Like I said, no complex joins yet, just retrieving data, just making sure we're comfortable with the options of asking questions and retrieving data. So here in SSMS, I'm going to do a new query. Okay, and again, I like to do a couple things, just basics when it comes to any programming language. First is comments, single line comments in SQL, 2 dashes. You'll see in here it's going to turn green. So I'm just going to type a comment. This is a single line comment. It turns green, which means it doesn't execute. Okay, so if I was to run this line of code, it doesn't execute. And there's also a multi-line comment in SQL, which is a / and an asterisk. And you can see this is a multi-line comment, and then you do asterisk and a / and then that'll end that comment. So those are your 2 commenting options when you work with the SQL language, just for familiarity's sake. And it's always good to, when you're learning a new language, it's always good to comment what you write so you remember what it's for later on. So we're going to work with a basic select statement. And what I'll do is delete out my comments, and I'll put a comment in that says basic select statement. A basic select statement is going to start out with the word select. Again, when you're working with SQL, it's not case sensitive. My recommendation for best practices is get comfortable using an approach that your peers and coworkers use, or an approach that you use regularly as far as how you write and structure your code, and just be consistent with it. So some people might like to use keywords and reserve words with capital letters. Some might like to keep everything lowercase. Again, it's a personal preference. You can see that SSMS will take reserved words like select, and it's going to turn them blue. So you'll see some color changes occurring here inside of this IDE. So from a customers table, I'm going to just retrieve everything in my customers table. And a basic select statement to do that is select followed by an asterisk, followed by the from clause, and after that you specify the table name. So my table name is customers in this case. Okay. Again, objects in SQL Server are not case sensitive. There are settings in SQL Server that you can configure and turn on to make it case sensitive. But in traditional Windows behavior, Windows is not a case-sensitive operating system. SQL Server doesn't tend to be case-sensitive unless somebody has set settings accordingly to be that way. So for those of you who work on Linux environments, work with Oracle, MySQL, you may get a little frustrated if you learn in a non-case-sensitive environment. Then you start to write some queries in case-sensitive environments, and you don't always get the results that you were hoping for. So keep that in mind as well. So with this, select star from customers or select asterisk from customers. What this says, it says return all rows and all columns. Okay, the asterisk is on the column line, so after the select word you list your columns, and if you kind of hold your mouse there, you can see that IntelliSense in part of SSMS is going to show you all the fields that are going to get pulled back in their data types, which is kind of cool. Little tooltip help. But if you don't put any specific fields on the select line and use the asterisk, you're going to get them all. And then from customers with no condition, so there's no where clause on here. What that means, it's going to return all of the records. And if I execute this command, and when I work in SSMS, I like to highlight the command I'm going to execute, because there's a lot of times when I will keep multiple commands on my query editor, which can be very dangerous. So if you ever get in a practice of writing extra commands on here, be very cautious and get in the habit of selecting just what you want to execute. It's okay with select statements because except for long-running queries, they're going to be pretty harmless. But when it comes to other types of commands like updates, inserts, deletes, having multiple ones of those on a command window can get you in trouble. And I've watched a lot of young developers do that over the years, and ones that have sit near me, and you know they're working in SQL, and if they curse, you can tell that they've actually ran a statement that they didn't intend to run every once in a while. And then we have to go to backups, or we hope that they weren't working on a production system. So in this case, I'm just going to warn you. So my habit, because I've been working with this tool for so long, is to always highlight the command I'm going to run. And I also don't like to leave too many extra commands there. If I'm working in production, definitely I would not leave extra commands here. But if I'm working in dev or test, I'm more likely to be a little bit sloppier with the commands that I might leave on my screen. But again, with less risk of impact. So be careful. If I click execute, you'll see what happens here is all the columns, so all the columns that you see underneath the customers table are retrieved, and all of the records are returned. Okay, so we returned 91 rows in this table. There's 91 records, there's 91 rows in the results set. When you run a select star like this with no other settings in your terminal or anything set up, again, being cautious that you're not going to retrieve millions of records, so keep that in mind too. So when you get to retrieving your data, your goal is to refine your queries to find what you're looking for. Likely you don't need an entire extract of something. Chances are you're going to need a few fields and records that meet some type of condition. So be cautious if you have millions of records in a table, because it could take a long time for it to retrieve, and if it's production, again, you could cause performance impacts, and you don't want that to be the case. If you're ever wondering before you work with structure how many records you're dealing with, what you could always do, and I'll show you a basic SQL function, and I'll just I'll do a basic SQL count function to count the records. So I'll put that in my comment for this one. And all you do is put the word count in front of the asterisk. So I don't want to get too much into SQL functions or anything tonight, but this one's good to know as like a starting function, because you can say to yourself, well, before I retrieve all the records from a system, let me see how many records are in there. Okay, so if I execute this and also a shortcut here is Control E if you set up your tools to do that, which is execute, versus me clicking. Sometimes you may not see me click because I hit Control E, but you'll see that that tells me there's 91 records, okay, in my results. So that's a good little test before you run your query. Another thing you could do if you said, okay, well, I don't want to return all of the records, we can do is use the top statement to limit our results. So in SQL, in SQL Server, you can use the top statement. Or you could use bottom too if you wanted to. So what you can do is say, okay, well, 91 records, we don't want that many to come back. We just want a handful. We don't need to see them all. We can do select top, let's say 10 star from our structure, okay? And what that'll do is it's going to retrieve just the top 10 records for us. And that's another little tip that comes in handy. So if you don't want to limit, or you don't know what your where clause needs to be yet, you want to see a sampling of the data, you could always start out with just the first few records, see the results, and then go there with those results, and then start refining your query accordingly. Okay. The next piece we'll look at is let's just bringing back only the columns of data we need. So let's add to our SQL query, and let's just bring back columns that we need. So instead of using an asterisk, let's say in this case we just want the company name, the city, and the region, and the postal code, and the country. So we'll go select company name, comma, city, comma, region, comma, postal code, and comma, country. So that's our select list. You're going to see that it's all underlined right now, and when you see things underlined, you always say to yourself, well, something must be wrong. Well, I didn't do a from yet, and my editor can't resolve, what I'm pulling these from. So hopefully once I touch customers here, you're going to see all of that clean itself up, and it does. Okay. So when you do this, select company name, city, region, postal code, country from customers. What this is going to do is it's going to bring back just those columns now. You'll no longer have all of the other columns get returned. So you're just bringing back a small subset of the columns that you're asking for. So you can separate your columns with a comma, okay, and just list the ones that you need. Another one of my pointers and tips is that when you're retrieving data from a database table, just like you don't want to bring back too many records, you only want to bring back the columns that you need to actually work with. You bring back too many columns, you're going to bring back data that's unnecessary, and sometimes cause confusion or accidentally get used when you may not want it to. Okay, so this is the basic select statement, just with a column list coming from one database table, which is our customers table. We're going to touch on just a few other things here. We're going to work on limiting the data now. We're going to do a basic where clause, and we'll see how that works. So limiting data with a basic where clause. Now, with our where clauses, they can be very complex. They can have multiple conditions, compound conditions, ands or ors. But tonight, we're not going to make it complicated. We're going to just keep it simple. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a where clause. So this is saying select the data for these columns where a condition is met. And the condition I want to be met is I want the country, okay, to equal, and I'm just going to scan the country list real quick because I think US is in here. It's USA in the case of this data. So I know it's a character field. So if we look over here, we see it's an nvarchar. So it's a character-based field. We're going to put it inside of quotation marks. Okay, so I'm going to put USA inside of quotation marks. So what this will do is it's going to retrieve my rows of data that match the condition of USA. So if I run this here, we're going to execute it, and you'll see that I have 13 records that match the condition of USA. Okay, so I have 13 companies or customers in my customer table that match the country of USA. Okay, so very simple where clause in this case. We're going to add to this by sorting the data, because sorting the data can make the data look a little bit better. So when we give it to our customers or our end results, it's good to know how to sort the data. So with this one where clause piece, we're going to add a sort condition. And what we're going to do is add a comment that says sort the results by state and then by city. So we're going to do a compound sort essentially. We're going to say order by. So in SQL, to sort your data, use order by. We're going to order by region. Okay. The default way of ordering is A to Z, which is ascending. So what you'll expect from that result there is you're going to see AK Alaska first, and then we're going to subsort by city. Okay, so if you have anybody that has more than one record in a region, like Eugene and Elgin, Oregon, and Portland, Oregon, you're going to see the cities be alphabeticalized as a secondary sort. So if we run this now, and you can have as many order bys as you want, okay, just like the fields you have, you can list all of your fields in your order by if you wanted to. You'll see now Anchorage, Alaska comes up first because that is an A for Alaska, then the C is for California. And then when you get down to the O's, you'll see that the secondary sort puts Portland after the Elgin and the Eugene, Oregon. Okay, so you can multiple column sort. If you, for some reason, wanted to say, okay, well, regions from A to Z and cities from Z to A, we could flip a sort. You can use DESC as a reserved word or a keyword. You could do descending sorts too. So the default sorting, you don't have to specify, but there's ASC for ascending. SQL automatically assumes it. Descending, though, you actually have to type it out. So if we were to run this now, you check your results, and Washington and Portland are good examples. You'll see that their cities will go reverse alphabetical order, so a descending sort. Okay. Again, the intent here is to look at just the basics of the select statement this evening. I do not want to overcomplicate this by going into compound conditions or join conditions. If you find that this has been helpful and useful, I'll continue part 2 session going into compound conditions and into using join statements and all, and just focus the session on that. Before we conclude this evening, we're going to do a couple quick examples of the DML. We're going to first work with the insert statement, then we're going to work with the update statement, and then we're going to work with the delete statement. And to work with the DML, we're going to look at a simple structure called categories this evening. Categories has 3 fields: a category ID, it has a category name, it has a description, and it has a picture. Okay, picture and description are null, meaning we don't have to fill them in. Category name is required, and the primary key is required. The only interesting thing about the primary key is we're curious if SQL Server has it as an identity column, because if it does, we don't actually have to fill in a category ID. So before I actually write my statement to insert data, we're going to take a quick look at the properties of this table. So we can right click and go to properties, and we can check to see if there's any identity column on setup. Actually, the easiest way to do that would be to right click and go to design. I apologize. And if we look at category ID, if we go down in the column properties, we're going to be looking to see is if it's identity, and it is a yes. What that means is it will automatically create the value of that primary key for us, so we won't actually have to create it. So what I'm going to end up doing here is creating an insert statement on category name and description. Category ID will automatically get created. So what I'll do here is check the categories first with a simple select statement. Select star from categories. And what we'll do is we'll look. We see that there's 8 currently. There's beverages, condiments, a few others, seafood. What we'll do is create a new category, and we're going to call it vegan. Okay, so to do that, we're going to write an insert statement. Insert a new category. PK is a identity, which means we don't need to include it. So what we'll do is insert into categories. That's the name of our table. And there's shorthand for doing insert statements. I'm going to advise you not to take shortcuts. Always specify your field list. It'll save you headaches in the future. Trust me. You can avoid them if you're going to put values in every one of your fields, but out of good practices, always list your fields. So table name followed by fields that you're going to fill. And like I said, we need to fill category name at a minimum, but I'm also going to fill in description. Okay, you're going to see description turn blue in SQL Server. It's a reserved word. I'm not a big fan of tables that use reserved words as object names or field names, but when you work with them, I recommend putting square braces around them because it'll just keep it specific that you're talking about the user-defined name, not to avoid any confusions. And then your list is values. So my category name is going to be vegan, and that's going to be inside of quotation marks, and your description inside of quotation marks because these are character and text fields. So for vegan, I'm going to put a description that says this is for vegetarians. Okay, very simple. This is just an insert statement. And the goal here is to insert one record of data into this table. If all goes well, you're going to see one row is affected. That record gets in. And if we were to select star from categories, but let's not just do a select star. Let's do a where clause. And let's say we're category name equals vegan. Let's look for our actual data. Why do a select star when we know how to do a where clause now? Let's go ahead and narrow it down to our record. And you'll see there it is, category 9. This is for vegetarians. Okay, so that was our quick little example of insert statement. Now we're going to take that off. We don't want to accidentally execute that a second time, so we'll get that out of our way. Let's update the data, update the category we created. To update data, you're going to do update the name of our table, which is categories, and we're going to change the category name to equal vegetables. Okay, we're going to call it vegetables instead. And we're going to do where category ID equals 9. Okay, so that's a identity field or an integer field. We can just use it with no quotation marks. All right. Now this one's underlined, and let's just double check, did I spell anything wrong? Category. Every once in a while, you'll see the SQL Server query window have problems. And but in this case, the reason it's having a problem is if I roll my mouse over it, it's going to give me a tooltip that tells me why. And what happened was I forgot to put the keyword set in front of this. So you need to set a field. So what I'm doing here is updating this table, and then what I want to update is I have to set whatever fields I want to change. So category name, I want to say vegetables. I can also change the description at the same time. Again, because it's that reserved word, I'm going to put it inside of brackets. I'm going to say description equal to this is green foods. Okay, so I can separate the fields I want to change with commas. So I can change one field, or I can change multiple fields all at once with my update statement. And a simple where clause will assure me that I just update that one record. I click execute, it updates. I run my previous query, and there's no longer a category name of vegan. But what I want to do is I want to check out category ID of 9 now to see if it has the new information. If I hit select where category ID is 9, you'll see it. Okay, so that's the DML for update statements. And then lastly, let's remove the data we don't need. Remove the category we don't need. Now, the thing to know about this, it's not going to be a problem. I'll be able to delete it without no issue. And that's because it doesn't have any relationships yet to any products. So I won't have any problems. But when you're removing data from a database table, you have to know if it's got any foreign key constraints that might stop you from deleting it in the future. Just a future tip. Right now, that's not going to be a problem. So if I just do delete from categories, and again, with your updates and deletes, be very careful with your where clause. Okay, so where category ID equals 9, we'll get rid of it. But what I always say before you do an update or a delete, write it as a select statement. Comment out the delete and do select star from categories where category ID is 9. Make sure that's the record you really want to change or delete. If it is, comment out the select, uncomment the delete, and run your command. All is removed, then you can double check it, and all should be good. So that's your delete statement and your DML command. So tonight you saw the basics of a select statement, you saw the basics of an update, a delete, and an insert, and it should have set your knowledge as a base foundation for working with SQL commands this evening. So we covered the DDL a little bit, the DQL, and then the DML. And that concludes everything in part 1 session. So I hope you enjoyed it. And lastly, if you have questions, feel free to place them out there in the comments. Be happy to answer. You guys can reach out to me personally. If anybody wants more in-depth sessions, more than happy to host them in the future. Feel free to think about contributing to my cause as I prepare to run the half marathon in Vegas at the end of the month. And there's my link for donations. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed the session.